I never thought I'd be starting over at 72. But when my husband died and the bills showed up like strangers knocking at my door, I realized I'd spent my whole life taking care of others and never learned how to take care of myself. My name is Carol Henderson, 72 years old, born and raised in New Jersey, a woman who spent her whole life building a home instead of a life of her own. I was the mother who packed school lunches, attended every parent teacher conference, ironed shirts even when my back hurt, and made Thanksgiving dinners big enough to feed a small army. I believed, foolishly maybe, that a warm house guaranteed a grateful family. I believed that if I kept giving, someone would notice how hard I tried. I believed love always came back, but life has a way of teaching late lessons to women like me. When my husband William passed away, I wasn't just left with silence, I was left with debt. Years of hidden bills I never knew existed suddenly filled my mailbox like angry reminders that I had lived behind a curtain, seeing only what I was allowed to. William had always handled the finances, and I never questioned it. We grew up in a generation where husbands were providers, wives trusted, and privacy in marriage wasn't always shared. But the morning after his funeral, I stood in the kitchen surrounded by envelopes with red stamps and totals I couldn't even process. Medical debt, credit card balances, unpaid taxes, loans I didn't even know existed. Every sheet of paper told the same story. You don't own your life, Carol, not even now. I thought that was the worst part. I thought the shock would fade. But the real pain came when I realized I couldn't stay in the home where I raised my children. The realtor walked through the house with a professional smile, but I saw the pity settling in her eyes. She looked at the picture frames, the fading wall where we marked the children's heights, the kitchen window where I cooled pies every holiday, and all she saw was value per square foot. I signed the selling papers with shaky hands. I didn't cry in front of her. I waited until she drove away before I let the tears out, pressing my forehead against the front door one last time like saying goodbye to a person, not a house. Then came the conversation with my children. They weren't cruel, they were busy, adults with jobs and schedules and children of their own. We sat in my daughter's living room and she gently said, "Mom, maybe it's time to think about something comfortable. A retirement community, like companionship and medical support." Their faces were calm, practical, believing they were helping me. They didn't see I was drowning under words that felt like an obituary for the rest of my life. A retirement home, as if everything meaningful in me had expired the same day William did. I nodded, pretending to consider it, pretending that 72 meant my story was over. But I lay awake that night realizing something. I had spent my whole life taking care of others. Now there was no one left to take care of. And I didn't even know who I was outside of that. The next morning, I opened my laptop, an old model, but it worked, and searched for small apartments for rent. I didn't know what I was looking for, only that I couldn't go somewhere to wait for life to end. Then I saw it, small studio above bakery, affordable, community neighborhood, available immediately. It wasn't logical, it wasn't expected. It wasn't what anyone would think a 72-year-old widow should do. But I sent the email, packed 2 suitcases, and rented the apartment sight unseen. When I arrived, the staircase was narrow, the apartment tiny, and the kitchen barely large enough for a single pan. But when I opened the window and smelled the early morning bread from downstairs, I smiled for the first time in months. It was warm. It was mine. It was a beginning, not an ending. That night, I sat on the small bed and realized something powerful. I had lost everything that defined me, but for the first time in my life, I finally had the chance to define myself. Text, I woke up on my first morning in the new apartment to the soft rumble of bakery mixers below me and the smell of warm bread drifting through the floorboards. For a moment, I forgot where I was. I reached across the bed expecting William to be there, and when my hand touched empty sheets, the reality of my new life settled in again, equal parts painful and freeing. I sat up slowly, rubbing the stiffness out of my joints, and looked around my tiny studio. One single window, one bed, a table, and walls still bare except for the hook where I'd hung my coat the night before. I wasn't a woman who believed in signs, but that coat hook felt symbolic. I had finally hung up my old life. My phone buzzed, a message from my daughter, Melissa. "Morning, Mom. We were talking last night. Maybe we should schedule a tour of some retirement communities. We just worry about you." Worry. A word I had spent decades understanding from the other side. I typed a response, deleted it, tried again, deleted it. Anything I said would invite another argument. So instead, I sent, "Good morning. I'm settling in. I'll call you later." I didn't tell her I had already chosen my future. Some battles are easier if you never open the door to them. I dressed, fixed my hair, and went downstairs to introduce myself. The bakery was smaller than I imagined, more a neighborhood secret than a business, but it had soul. The kind of place where the glass bakery cases were always half full because regulars came early and bought everything before noon. A woman in her 50s stood behind the counter filling an order box. She looked up, smiled warmly, and said, "You must be the new tenant." Yes, I nodded. Carol Henderson. I promise I don't make much noise. She laughed. Sweetheart, unless you're planning to drive a tractor through the ceiling, you can't make more noise than my ovens. Her name was Ruth, owner, baker, cashier, manager, everything except a magician, though the pastries displayed behind her glass counter made me suspect otherwise. We talked for a few minutes, and before I could stop myself, I confessed I wasn't just new to the building, I was new to starting over. Ruth paused while sliding a tray of croissants into a paper bag. Starting over isn't something most people do, she said, especially not at 70. I expected judgment. Instead, she smiled and added, It means you're brave. It had been a long time since someone used that word about me. She handed me a warm blueberry muffin and waved away my attempt to pay. Welcome to the next chapter, she said. I ate it at the tiny table near the window, and for the first time in months, the food didn't taste like something I was forcing down just to have enough energy to survive the day. When I got back upstairs, I found 10 missed calls from both of my children. I stared at the phone, exhausted just looking at the notifications. I didn't want to fight. I didn't want tears, guilt, speeches about safety, dependence, or what's best for my age. Didn't want them to talk to me like someone halfway to the grave, but I knew I couldn't ignore them forever. I called Melissa back. She answered on the first ring, her voice sharp with stress. Mom, we've been calling all morning. Are you okay? I'm fine, I said. You never called last night, she replied, voice shifting into that tone children get when they think they've become the parent. We were worried something happened. Something did happen, I said softly. I moved. Moved where? I took a breath. A small place above a bakery in town. Silence, not the kind that meant acceptance, the kind that meant someone was gathering steam before responding. Mom, she stretched the word out like a sigh. Why didn't you tell us we could have helped? Help. My entire life had been about helping them, helping teachers, helping neighbors, helping community groups. I had spent decades being helpful. And now, at 72, what I wanted wasn't help, it was independence. Because I didn't want to debate, I answered calmly. You should have come to us first. I sat down on my small bed. Sweetheart, I've spent my whole life going to other people first. This time I needed the decision to be mine. But you're alone, Melissa said. No, I'm just not surrounded. Another silence. And this time her voice softened. I just don't want to lose you. I closed my eyes. You won't, but you might have to learn that I'm still a person, not just a mother to manage, she exhaled. Dad always took care of everything. I know, and that was the problem. We talked for a few more minutes, neither of us winning, neither of us completely giving in. When the call ended, I felt drained but strangely proud. I had stood up for myself without yelling, without crying, without apologizing. Women from my generation rarely did that. That afternoon, the landlord knocked on my door with a simple contract to sign. He was a thin man in his 60s named Arthur who owned both the building and the bakery space below. He handed me the paperwork and said, No lease term required. Stay as long as you want. It was the kindest thing he could have offered. After losing a home I thought I'd die in, the idea of not having to fear the next eviction or rent increase felt like a gift. That night, after unpacking the few belongings I brought with me, I sat on the bed again and stared at the ceiling. The building creaked, the bakery machines hummed below, the night breeze rattled the small window, but none of the sounds bothered me. They were signs of life, not loneliness. The next day, my son called. Brian was always the more logical one: numbers, schedules, spreadsheets, problem solving. He didn't yell, he didn't guilt trip, he planned. Mom, he said as soon as I answered, I found 4 assisted living communities within 20 minutes of your old house. I've scheduled tour for Saturday. I closed my eyes. Here it comes. Brian, I said gently, I'm not going on any tour. He paused. You're being emotional. I get it. You just lost Dad. No, Brian, I'm being alive. He didn't understand. Most children don't. They look at parents and see 2 stages, the stage when they need us and the stage when they think we need them. The middle, where we are still individuals with desires, fears, dreams, doesn't occur to them until life forces the realization. Mom, he said, exhaling sharply, you shouldn't have to work or struggle. We don't want you living in some tiny room above a bakery. That tiny room is mine, I answered. For now, he replied. But what happens if you get sick? What happened when I spent 30 years cooking, cleaning, and raising children while ignoring my own health? I asked quietly. He didn't have an answer. I'm not choosing difficulty, I said. I'm choosing control. Silence again. The kind that tells you someone is trying to swallow disappointment. We'll talk later, he said finally. Okay. After the call, I sat for a long time staring at the little kitchenette across the room. The refrigerator hummed, the single countertop was spotless, and a single cup sat drying next to the sink. I realized that for the first time in decades, I had a space completely my own. No one else's dishes, schedules, preferences, noise, mess, or expectations. Just me. In the afternoon, I went downstairs again to return the tray from the muffin Ruth had given me the day before. She smiled when she saw me. You look taller today, she said. Taller. When people stop asking permission to live their own lives, they usually gain an inch. I laughed. She handed me a rag and pointed at a tray of cooled cupcakes. You want a frost? I've never done that professionally, I said. Doesn't matter, just try. So I did. We stood at the stainless steel counter together, and I piped swirls of buttercream on vanilla cupcakes. I wasn't perfect, some were crooked, some too big, but Ruth didn't correct me once. When I finished, she looked at the tray and said, "Congratulations, you just made something from scratch and didn't apologize for it. That puts you ahead of half the world." I had never been praised for something so simple, not in a long time. After closing, we sat at a tiny table with 2 cups of coffee. She talked about how she opened the bakery after her divorce, how people told her she was too old to start a business at 52, how she did it anyway. She told me something that stuck with me. People think aging makes you smaller. What they don't know is that life can get bigger if you finally live it for yourself. When I went back upstairs that evening, I looked around my apartment again, not as a place I ran to after losing everything, but as the place where I was gaining something I didn't know I'd been missing all my life. That night, I turned off the lights, climbed into bed, and listened, not to silence, but to the thrum of new beginnings vibrating up from the bakery below. For the first time in many months, I slept without tears. I woke up the next morning earlier than usual, not because of obligation, but because I wanted to. That alone felt strange. For years, mornings meant duty packing lunches, ironing shirts, preparing breakfast, getting ahead of whatever chaos the day might bring. I had been a wife, mother, caretaker, scheduler, comforter, problem solver, referee, and emotional sponge. But now, when my eyes opened in that tiny apartment above the bakery, the morning belonged to me. I stretched, sat up, and took a moment just to breathe. Women don't talk about this enough, the quiet shock of suddenly having your own time after decades of giving it away. It felt like someone had silently returned years I thought I'd lost. I fixed a cup of instant coffee, 1 mug, just for me, and stood at the window as the sky shifted from purple to soft gold. I watched the bakery employees file in, aprons tied, hair pulled back, ready for the morning rush. The street outside slowly came alive with headlights, dog walkers, kids with backpacks, and tired parents clutching travel mugs the way soldiers hold shields. And I realized something simple but powerful. I wasn't a bystander in their world, I was part of it. I dressed and went downstairs, not sure if I was supposed to show up, but when I pushed the bakery door open, Ruth waved me inside as if she'd been expecting me for years. "You hungry?" she asked. "Always." She slid a warm chocolate chip scone across the counter. I ate it standing up like a teenager late for school, crumbs on the front of my shirt, and I laughed at myself because I hadn't done something that free or silly in decades. Somewhere along the years, I had learned to eat properly, speak softly, keep myself neat, and shrink into someone acceptable. But no one here cared if crumbs dusted my sweater. After breakfast, Ruth pointed to the kitchen. "If you want the job, the station is open." I blinked. "Job," she shrugged. "You worked 24-hour days for 40 years. Frosting cupcakes will feel like a vacation." I didn't have a resume. I didn't have retail or food experience. I didn't have references except a lifetime of putting other people first, but somehow I knew that was enough. "I'll take it," I said, and just like that, I had my first real job in decades. The bakery kitchen became my small universe. Stainless steel counters, the sweet scent of vanilla and sugar, the hum of ovens and trays cooling on racks like soldiers lined up in formation. My station was simple: piping bags, spatulas, frosting bowls, and rows of unfrosted cupcakes waiting their turn to become someone's treat, someone's comfort, someone's happy moment. It was strange, at first, to use my hands for work that wasn't motherhood. I had baked thousands of cupcakes in my life, school bake sales, birthday parties, fundraising events, but those were chores disguised as service. These cupcakes were different. I was paid for these, trusted for these, needed for these, not as mom, not as Mrs. Henderson, but as Carol. The younger employees called me Miss Carol, a title I hadn't earned but appreciated. They showed me how to swirl frosting in the bakery's signature style, how to sprinkle topping without clumping, how to wipe the plate edge for a clean presentation. And when a cupcake came out sloppy, they didn't criticize. They just laughed and said, "It happens, try again." I didn't know how much I needed that kind of grace until it surrounded me. Late that afternoon, I was restocking the front display when a woman in a business suit walked in, shoulders stiff, eyes exhausted. She ordered a red velvet cupcake and sat alone at a corner table. Halfway through, she burst into tears, quiet, controlled, the kind of crying women do when they're trying not to appear weak in front of strangers. Ruth nudged me. "You go," she whispered. I approached slowly, unsure what to say. She wiped her eyes and apologized. "I'm sorry, long day." I sat across from her. "I've had a lifetime of those," she laughed, surprised by the honesty. And just like that, a stranger opened up about a stressful job, a broken relationship, and how she didn't have anyone to talk to because everyone assumed she was strong. I nodded. "People forget that strong women get tired too." She looked at me the way someone looks at a window suddenly cracked open in a suffocating room. When she left, she said, "I'll be back tomorrow, not just for the cupcake, That moment changed everything. I realized I wasn't just making frosting swirls. I was part of something human, something real, something I had missed during the last years of caring for a husband who didn't tell me he was drowning in debt while I was drowning in routine. When Ruth handed me my first small envelope at the end of the week, I held it like a relic. I didn't need the money, not yet, but it represented something money rarely does: proof that I still existed in the world, proof that I was useful. Proof that I was more than someone's past. I didn't spend it. I tucked it inside a small notebook in my bedside drawer, a reminder that 72 wasn't too late to start earning not income but dignity. Of course, my children eventually found out I was working, not because I told them, but because a neighbor recognized me behind the bakery counter and mentioned it to Melissa while picking up her kids from school. That evening, my phone rang. I answered, bracing myself. Mom, Melissa began, are you working? I am. Why, you don't need to work. I know, I said. I want to. There was a long silence. The kind mothers know means a grown child is thinking but doesn't have the words. Finally, she said, is it safe? Are they treating you well? They are, I answered. Better than most people have treated me in a long time. There was a pause, then something I hadn't heard from her in months. I'm glad. We said goodnight. The call was short, but it wasn't heavy. For once, she didn't try to correct my choices. That night, I sat up in bed and wrote in a cheap spiral notebook, something I'd started doing since moving in. I wasn't writing poetry or philosophy, just small truths. That night I wrote, I am not rebuilding my life, I am building one for the first time. I stared at the sentence for a long time. Women like me don't often get second chances. But here I was, 72 years old, wearing a flour-dusted apron, frosting cupcakes, and finally learning how it feels to live for myself. Within weeks, I wasn't just an employee, I was a part of the fabric of that street. Locals greeted me by name. I learned that Mr. Jenkins only bought lemon bars on days his arthritis was bad. I learned young Anna came after school because she didn't want to go home to parents who always fought. I learned the mailman hated oatmeal cookies but loved snickerdoodles. People began saying things like, Carol, you always know what to say. You remind me of my grandmother. The bakery feels warmer when you're here. Warmth. I had spent decades giving it away. Now I was receiving it back. One evening, as I was cleaning the counter, Ruth came beside me and said, you know, when I hired you, I just thought you were looking for something to do. And now, I asked. Now I think you were looking for a place to be seen. I didn't answer. I couldn't speak because she was right. For decades, I had existed in the background of my own life, like wallpaper, necessary but unnoticed. And here, frosting cupcakes in a small Jersey bakery, I was finally visible, not because of what I provided, not because of what I sacrificed, not because of who depended on me, just because I was me. People talk about youth like it's the only time discovery happens. But standing there, wiping down stainless steel counters, I learned a truth I wish someone had told me earlier. Life doesn't stop revealing itself just because your hair turns gray. At 72, I had finally begun my first real chapter, not the one written for me, but the one I was writing myself. And the story wasn't over. No hiding, no extra fantasy, just realistic continuation in one flow. Working at the bakery became part of my life far more quickly than I expected. Within a month, I had a routine: wake up early, drink 1 cup of coffee by the window, and go downstairs to help the morning team. I wasn't a guest anymore. I belonged there. I was needed, trusted, and treated as someone with value. That feeling is not small when you're 72 and used to being remembered only when someone needs a holiday meal or a babysitter. The community around the bakery was ordinary: teachers, office workers, mechanics, single parents, elderly couples, teenagers figuring out themselves. But being among them made something inside me settle. I wasn't sitting alone in a big, silent house waiting for the phone to ring. I was surrounded by real people living real lives, and I was part of the daily movement of a neighborhood. Every morning, customers came in half awake, and I learned their patterns just by observing. A man named Ethan always bought 2 chocolate donuts before taking his daughter to school. Mrs. Franklin, retired and cheerful, bought a cinnamon scone every Wednesday after physical therapy. A young woman, maybe 20, usually came in near closing time wearing an exhausted expression. I later learned she worked 2 jobs and took night classes at the community college. People didn't tell me their whole stories at once. They revealed themselves gradually, in small conversations over the counter, in the way they laughed, or in the tired slump of their shoulders before that first sip of coffee. I had lived in my old neighborhood for over 40 years, and I didn't know half the people on my street. Yet here, in a matter of weeks, strangers were becoming something closer to companions. Not friends yet, but something that could become that. One Thursday morning, a young mother carrying a crying toddler came in looking overwhelmed. She apologized in a rush, tried to calm the child, and looked like she hadn't slept in days. I set a small oatmeal cookie on the counter in front of the toddler without saying a word. The crying stopped immediately. The mother stared at me with the kind of relief only a stranger can give. She whispered, "Thank you." I've been there, I said. Sometimes a cookie is better than advice. She laughed, the stress sliding off her shoulders, and I realized how much peace simple gestures could bring. When I worked in my own home for my own family, the things I did were invisible. No applause for dinner, no praise for clean shirts, no compliments for managing everything quietly. That was expected. But here, even small acts mattered to someone. One afternoon, Ruth took a break and sat at a table near the window. I poured her a coffee and joined her. She asked, "How are you settling in upstairs?" "I'm comfortable," I answered truthfully. "It's small, but it doesn't feel empty." "You know," she said, "a lot of people move into new places and wait for someone to make them feel welcome. Not many try to become part of the place themselves." I thought about that. In my old life, I wasn't part of anything outside the home. My world had been laundry, meals, bills, doctor appointments, school schedules, holidays, and eventually caretaking. When my children grew up and moved out and William passed, all that structure vanished. And without it, I had felt like nothing. Now, even if I was just the woman who frosted cupcakes and talked to customers, I was a piece of the community's daily rhythm. I felt present, I felt useful, and I hadn't realized how long it had been since I felt that. One day, a man came in carrying a worn backpack and walked up to the counter with hesitation. He looked hungry but embarrassed to ask. I recognized the expression, not pride exactly, but the fear of being judged for needing help. Without asking, I placed 2 bread rolls in a paper bag and handed it over. He said softly, "I don't have enough today." I shook my head. "You're fine." He looked down, nodded once, and left quickly. I didn't need thanks. Not everything needed to be acknowledged out loud. I had lived a lifetime doing the right thing quietly. When he returned a week later with enough money to pay, he placed the bills on the counter and said, "People remember kindness longer than you think." I realized that maybe the world wasn't as cold as I had assumed when I sat in my old house surrounded by unpaid bills and silence. My children visited occasionally, not as often as they promised, but that's life. People say we'll come soon with good intentions and tired minds. When they did visit, they looked around my apartment with surprise. I could almost see the calculations happening. She's happy here. She's not falling apart. She doesn't need rescuing. They still brought gifts, scented candles, food containers, fuzzy socks, but I knew those were small apologies disguised as presents. Apologies for assuming age made me fragile. Apologies for not paying attention sooner. Apologies for thinking the only acceptable next step for someone my age was waiting for life to finish. But I didn't blame them anymore. I had been a wife and mother who made everything look easy, who never showed when she was tired, who never talked about needing more. Children learn what we teach them not through advice but through example. I had taught them that I could handle everything. Now I was teaching them something else, that I was still living. Customers who came regularly began chatting with me at the counter about ordinary things, whether jobs, difficult bosses, how expensive everything had become, how fast the children were growing. Those conversations grounded me. They reminded me that I wasn't the only person who struggled, who adapted, who held herself together in private and appeared calm in public. One evening after closing, the younger staff invited me to sit with them for a late dinner in the kitchen. I hesitated at first. In my head, I was much older than they were, but they insisted and I joined. We sat around the stainless steel table, eating leftover pastries and sandwiches, talking about our days. One of the girls, maybe 19, said, "Miss Carroll, you give the best advice." I laughed. "I've spent 70 years collecting it. Might as well use it." She asked, "How do you stay calm?" "I panic about everything." "I used to panic too," I told her. "I just did it while making dinner and nobody noticed." They laughed, and I realized I was laughing genuinely with them, not politely out of habit. The sound surprised me. It felt unfamiliar, like a voice I hadn't heard since I was young. When I went back upstairs afterward, the room didn't feel small. It felt full, full of voices, full of stories, full of the ordinary pulse of life that I hadn't experienced in years. I sat at my table and wrote again in the same notebook. I used to think belonging meant being surrounded by family. Now I know belonging can also mean being seen by people who have no reason to see you except that they choose to. That night, I went to bed peacefully. Not because everything was perfect, not because I had solved every problem, but because I had become part of a living world again. I was not waiting out my days, I was inside them. In the morning, the bakery downstairs came alive once more, and I smiled when I heard the ovens warming, the mixers starting, the low voices of the staff getting ready for the day. I wasn't just hearing sounds, I was hearing my place in the world. And after so many years of living for others, that was more than. Life didn't suddenly become dramatic, glamorous, or extraordinary. It simply became steady, and that was something I had not experienced in years. Stability when you are older feels like a luxury, not financial stability. I was still learning to manage that, but emotional stability. The sense of waking up and knowing who you are, where you belong, and what the day asks from you. The bakery became part of my identity. Not my entire identity, but a living part of it. Work I could show up to, people who counted on me, and a place that had space for me. I cleaned, baked, served customers, took inventory, wiped tables, closed registers, and unlocked the doors at dawn. Nothing about the job would impress anyone on paper, but real life doesn't happen on paper. Real life happens in small rooms where people show up, do their best, talk about ordinary things, and go home tired but satisfied. Over time, I started saving small amounts from each paycheck. Not a lot, but enough that I no longer felt frightened when I checked my bank balance. I created a simple budget in a notebook. Every expense was written down: utilities, rent, groceries, medical copies, and a tiny section labeled "just because." That section wasn't about shopping or luxury. It was for something I had never allowed myself before, spending on myself without guilt. Some weeks it was a new pair of socks. Sometimes a used book from a thrift store. Once I bought a slightly nicer lipstick, and the cashier smiled at me and said, "Treat yourself." I realized how rare those words had been in most of my life. At home, the apartment began to slowly carry the shape of me. A plant near the window, a framed picture of my grandchildren on the shelf, a calendar with handwritten reminders. One evening, I taped a recipe card to the cupboard door with a note: "This kitchen belongs to someone who is still learning." Not perfect, not defeated, learning. At 72, people assume learning is for the young, but no one tells you that learning might be the thing that keeps you from fading as you age. I learned to read contracts. I learned to write checks. I learned to check my credit score. I learned that there was nothing wrong with asking questions. Younger adults at the bakery were kind enough to show me things without talking down to me. That mattered. Some nights I sat at the small table near the window and wrote in my notebook about the things I had never spoken aloud. Things like, "I miss being needed by my family, but I love being respected by strangers. I am not a widow. I am a woman who happens to have lost her husband. I spent decades taking care of everyone else. Now I am learning how to take care of myself." Writing didn't fix everything, but it organized the truth, and that was enough. My children continued to stop by occasionally. My daughter brought a pie one afternoon and said, "Mom, I still feel bad that you had to move." I told her gently, "I didn't have to, I chose to." She paused, absorbing that. I could tell that sentence changed something in her understanding. Until then, she had believed life pushed me into a corner and I had surrendered. She hadn't seen that I stepped forward. That I signed the rental papers, packed the suitcases, and created a new life with my own hands. My son visited later and looked around the apartment before saying, "It's smaller than the old house, but it feels lighter in here." He was right. Sometimes a room the size of a single memory can be more freeing than a house full of history. The real turning point came one Saturday morning. The bakery was busy, lines out the door, customers impatient and hungry. A new employee was trying to handle orders but was overwhelmed, hands shaking as receipts printed faster than she could organize. Without thinking twice, I stepped in beside her. "Slow down," I told her quietly. "One order at a time. People can wait." She nodded, breathed, and focused. I filled cups, bagged pastries, greeted customers, and kept things moving. When the rush was over, she looked at me with watery eyes and said, "Thank you. I thought I was about to lose it." I smiled. "You didn't. You just needed someone beside you." That evening, I closed the bakery alone. I swept, wiped, cleaned, counted the register, and turned off the neon sign. As I locked the door, something occurred to me. For the first time in my entire life, I wasn't background support. I wasn't helping someone else fulfill their dreams without having any of my own. I was part of something in my own right. I wasn't filling shoes someone handed me. I was standing in my own. A few weeks later, I received a small raise, nothing dramatic but meaningful. Ruth simply said, "You've earned this." No speech, no emotional moment, just acknowledgement. And acknowledgement is more valuable at 72 than diamonds ever were at 20. Outside of work, I began building a small social life without planning it. The young mother I helped with the toddler started inviting me to the park sometimes. Mrs. Franklin and I occasionally shared a bench after her therapy appointments. One Thursday evening, the exhausted college student knocked on my apartment door holding a textbook and asked if she could study at my table because her shared apartment was too noisy. I made her tea and sat nearby doing crossword puzzles. We barely talked, but the silence was comfortable. When she finished, she said, "Thank you. It's easier to work when someone else is quietly working too." I knew exactly what she meant. Life wasn't spectacular, but it was connected. And that was something I didn't know I needed until I had it. In the spring, I decided to take a community class at the recreation center. It wasn't anything huge, just a weekly class on creative writing. I sat in a room with people decades younger and wrote short stories about life, work, motherhood, loss, and new beginnings. The instructor didn't treat me differently because of my age. She simply read my work, nodded thoughtfully, and said, "There is experience in these words." For the first time, my stories weren't trapped inside the walls of my house, spoken only to myself. I was sharing them without apologizing for existing. One day after class, a younger woman approached me and said, "Your story today made me feel less afraid of getting older." I smiled and replied, aging is not the end, it's just a different chapter. Walking home that day, I realized something. I no longer felt like a woman whose life had fallen apart. I felt like a woman whose life had changed direction. There is a difference. My refrigerator door now held more than grocery lists and bills. It had small evidence of life, a thank you note from a coworker, a flyer from the writing group, a magnet with the bakery logo, a picture drawn by a customer's child. Tiny things, but when you lose everything, tiny things mean a lot. As months passed, I built new habits. I learned to manage online banking. I learned how to request medical records. I learned to make decisions without checking if someone else approved. I wasn't just independent, I was capable, not perfect, not fearless, but capable. One night I wrote a sentence in my notebook that defined the entire journey. My age is not the end of the story, it is the proof that I survived every chapter before this one. I didn't write it dramatically. I didn't write it for an audience. I wrote it because I finally understood it. I am not the same woman who stood in her old kitchen surrounded by unpaid bills and grief. That woman was afraid, grieving, and lost. I understand her, but I am not her anymore. Today, I wake up early not because someone needs breakfast or a lunchbox or a permission slip signed. I wake up because I want to. I open the window, breathe in the bakery smells drifting upward, and I feel something that took me decades to earn: peace. Not happiness that shouts, not excitement that burns fast. Just quiet peace that stays. People believe that life slows down when you grow old. They think the final years are a waiting room, but I now know something different. Life does not slow down. Life becomes clearer. You stop pretending. You stop performing. You stop chasing applause. You start living simply and honestly. My story doesn't end with a miracle or a dramatic transformation. It ends with something far more realistic and meaningful. I found myself in a small apartment above a bakery, with floors that creak, with bills I pay myself, with work I do gladly, with people who know my name, with a life that finally belongs to me. After 72 years of serving everyone else, I finally learned how to serve myself without guilt. And that is not a sad ending. That is the best ending I could have asked for.